Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are offering you more awareness of the narratives that dominate your world. Today, we will be discussing the hero's journey narrative, one of the most consistent narratives across different cultures, schools of thought, and storytelling approaches worldwide. I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
And we are about to tell you why the hero's journey is so timeless and redeeming. So what is the hero's journey? It sounds quite self-explanatory, right? The hero's journey is what is known as a monomyth. And it's a common template of stories that generally involve a hero who goes on an adventure, sort of like an epic quest in some versions of the story. And this hero is victorious in a very difficult crisis or wisdom building event. And usually this hero comes home changed or transformed. At times, this person will impart this wisdom to the community, to a mentee, to a sibling, to an elder, to another person that the hero knows. The hero's journey is most frequently attributed to Joseph Campbell. And this comes from his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And although it's attributed to Joseph Campbell, I have to caution everyone on this, that the hero's journey has been millennia in the making. I mean, this is one of the oldest human stories that exist in many different areas of society, religion, cultures, psychology. So although I'm talking about the more recent interpretation by Joseph Campbell, which also has received a lot of literary criticism by narratologists and literary experts over the years since this book was published. But I think why this is significant is it's the most recent theories on the hero's journey. So Joseph Campbell used this monomyth to analyze and compare religions in the book. And the idea was that the basis stories in most world religions have to do with some sort of hero embarking on this quest, whether willingly or unwillingly. At times, there would be a mentor or a person or a being or spirit taking this hero into the journey if they were unwilling to go. And they would go through different stages of trials and tribulations until they gained this eternal wisdom that they were then able to turn around and become some kind of a prophet or teacher or guru in these cases. And this was mostly his focus in the book, but since the book has come out, it has been imparted to a lot of Hollywood movies follow this format. And there's a lot of literature on different books about how Hollywood movies are built around the hero's journey because it's such a popular narrative. So a little bit of the background on this is that, as I mentioned before with the religion example, the hero kind of ventures forth from the world of a common existence. And maybe they were living a docile or quiet existence before. And they move into this realm of like supernatural wonder or wisdom. And in some cases, there's resistance to this change. One of the best examples I can give you of this, and a very modern example, is the Star Wars saga. And there isn't a person watching this that probably hasn't seen or is familiar with the Star Wars saga. You have Luke Skywalker, who's this young man who is being introduced to this concept of the Jedi knighthood and is sort of like unwillingly pushed into becoming a Jedi with his mentor, Obi-Wan. And this is a very solid example of what Joseph Campbell represents in the book as the hero's journey. So throughout this experience, and as you realize, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars is going through all these stages of learning where he's trying to face this evil nemesis that happens to be his father. And through these stages of learning, he's not only gaining wisdom about himself, but also the universe around him and the multiverses, because Star Wars is set in multiverses, as many of you are aware. He's gaining this wisdom and communication with the deeper aspect of being and existence. And in the end, he's able to impart this wisdom to other people in the Star Wars galaxies and communities. I would say that another great example of this comes from the Divine Comedy, which was written by one of my favorite Catholic Church dissidents, Dante Alighieri. Angela is smiling over there because she's more than familiar with this book or this trilogy, of course. And we begin this trilogy with Dante, who's questioning the existence of what he's been taught through Catholicism. And he ultimately ends up pulled into the first ring, which is hell, by the poet Virgil, and is brought up through purgatory by a woman who was actually a great love of his life, whom he only actually met twice in his life, I believe, two or three times. He only ever saw her, but she haunted him so much that she ended up becoming in this epic piece of literature, this hero's journey, his guide through purgatory. Ultimately, he ascends up into the heavens to gain eternal wisdom from this experience. What ended up happening in reality is that he was excommunicated and could not be a practicing Catholic anymore in the eyes of the church. But for this case, he did gain a lot of wisdom, and he imparted a lot of wisdom through his literary work to others. So why the hero's journey is so powerful is it's in a class of narratives called a redemption narrative. And these narratives are a fabulous template for anyone wanting to sell something, to convince someone of something, and to make a promise that any suffering that we experience in this life will have a reward. And also there's kind of a promise with some of these narratives that you will also have a mentor or a guide to help you through these challenging questions. I bring this up and I say this, and I call this a template because this is an excellent sales pitch for any company or brand to build around a product so that anyone purchasing this product will feel a sense of redemption or self-actualization by using it. An example I've used recently in a piece that I wrote was about how wellness coaches use these hero's journey or redemption narratives about themselves to sell themselves to an audience, a willing audience too, of willing participants, but also to convince everyone that their program or platform will provide redemption from whatever ailments or suffering they're experiencing at the time being in the present. And so again, why it's important to be aware of the hero's journey narratives is the amount of seduction they have and the amount of hope that they give us. But one caution I would tell anybody, being the skeptical journalist in this, is that these hero's journey narratives are not always true. And sometimes there is tragedy, as we also see in the news, right? Sometimes there is not a deliverance from a bad situation, or maybe you gain the wisdom, but you die in the process, or there's a massive loss in the process that's permanent and irrevocable. And that is in many ways part of realizing that we cannot take this narrative and apply it to every aspect of our lives and hope that it will explain our existence. Because in some ways it can, there are happy endings, but in other ways it doesn't. And when it's applied in the wrong circumstances, politics, many politicians have used this, many Silicon Valley tech founders have used this to sell their product in pitches. And when we don't look deeper into this narrative or have at least some amount of skepticism, we end up with unintended consequences that we don't otherwise anticipate. So again, I can't stress enough, this narrative is much older than Joseph Campbell's book, and Angela is going to cover how the hero's journey has been with us for centuries and centuries of human existence through mythology. In fact, Angela, I actually see the hero's journey as a myth, not really necessarily just a narrative. It's a very common myth. So I turn it over to you.
Great introduction to the hero's journey. Some other common hero's journey stories are, of course, Lord of the Rings, any number of the Marvel movies. It's with us all the time. Ursula K. Le Guin said that the hero's journey informs a lot of not only the way that we think about entertainment, but also how we think about the evolution of technology, right? This is something that you actually had the opportunity to dig into quite recently. sort of the logic of Silicon Valley founders, this idea of saving the world is a very common interpretation of the hero's journey. So as you mentioned, yeah, as you mentioned, there are 3 stages to this. There's a call for adventure, which usually you don't necessarily want to hear at first. And then you overcome ordeals, defeat enemies, and then you return home transformed. It sounds great. Obviously, it's very marketable. There are a few strange issues with this, which Ursula Le Guin goes into in a charming little essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. To start with, it centralizes this idea that humans are the only thing that matter in a story. This was not necessarily true for much older myths. For example, Red Bead Woman, if you ever want to look up that story, it's a Yakut story of birth and rebirth that includes many different kinds of characters and also non-human characters. This was a more common type of story in sort of pre-literate storytelling, which is something that I'll go into later. Another thing it does is it romanticizes the individual. Everything that's happening to this individual hero on their journey is happening specifically for their benefit and also for their awakening, right? So all of the other characters, they really only matter to the individual insofar as they help with this enlightenment that will, that they can later take home to change their communities with. So you can see how it weaves itself into things like hustle culture, myths of technological progress, and even how we define our own personal progress. That was one of the things that you found when you were researching this, right? Like millennials measure themselves a lot by sort of this logic of we can optimize our lives or we can fail at it. And this is very much a hero's journey thing. But yeah, let's talk about where it comes from. So a lot of the most common stories that give rise to the hero's journey, come from Greek mythology. A few common ones you'll know are probably Ulysses, in the Odyssey, returning to Ithaca over 10 years after the Trojan War and having all those adventures. Perseus, Jason and the Argonauts. So these are quite common stories. To return to one of the issues of the hero's journey, Greece was a patriarchy. This is like a really long subject for another time. And so the heroes, these sort of bombastic characters that appear in, primary Greek mythologies were mostly men. Like heroes was like clearly defined. And quite often they were defined by killing women. For example, Perseus killing Medusa, who was not actually a danger. She was hiding until he murdered her and removed her head and took one of her children, which was Pegasus, and then used her head as a weapon. Or the Amazons. The only thing that we know about the Amazons of Greek mythology was that they were women and they were foreign, and heroes were kind of defined by killing them. For example, Achilles is a very good example of this. Obviously, there's a lot more complexity to Greek myth as well. Greece was not only a patriarchy, it was also concerned with finding balance. This is actually one of the things that gets missed in the Odyssey, for example. Ulysses' hero's journey is not only a story about the man and the hero, it's also a story about a man coming home transformed after multiple interactions with different kinds of women. Calypso, Circe, even Scylla and Charybdis are female. So this is it's also kind of a domestic story that's mirrored against the coming home story of Agamemnon, who's obviously murdered by his wife because he killed their daughter as a sacrifice much earlier in that drama. So there are little nuances like this that are kind of missed. Another thing that I want to mention is even before Greek myths, heroes' journeys occur in lots of cultures and for far longer in our story. And there's this kind of strange theory about how they sort of come about. A lot of Greek stories are built on things like Sumerian mythology. And a lot of mythologies generally in the world are built on this other kind of myth, this myth of the rise of a sun god who kills a primordial goddess, typically a snake. The snake is an ancient symbol of femininity. This was quite commonly understood in sort of like pre-literate times. I'll return to this whole like literacy thing in a minute.
It's quite elaborate, everyone. I mean, as you can see, this is not just a book called by Joseph Campbell. It's a thousands of years of stories here.
Super complicated. Yeah. So early myths are full of these kinds of stories of sun gods killing snakes, right? Like the Greeks have it, Apollo who kills a python, which is a snake, and then appropriates her power of prophecy. That's how he creates the Pythia and ultimately the Oracle of Delphi. Egypt had it. Apophis was a snake. It was the greatest nemesis to the sun god Ra, and Apophis is murdered. Mesoamerica had it. Huitzilopochtli, who was the sun god of the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, was in this constant existential battle against darkness. And in order to kick off that battle, he was defending the murder of his mother, who was a snake goddess as well. The murderer in that story is his sister, the moon goddess, which is also a very common female symbol, the moon, because of its association with menstruation, obviously. So
Cycles, the moon cycles, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can also see how this weaves itself into our cultural myths. For example, the Garden of Eden, Eve getting tempted by a snake. That's a really good kind of dog whistle in particularly Abrahamic mythology. Whenever you see a snake in a saint story or even in the Bible, usually it's a reference to a very old idea about the volatility of women's power.
Mm-hmm.
So where does this convention comes from? The sort of thing that precedes the hero's journey. There was a neuroscientist called Leonard Shlain, who in the 90s wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, who made the argument that these kinds of stories occur and these sort of consequent, rigid, authoritarian, patriarchal systems are developed after the adoption of an alphabet by various societies. This is like a really complicated theory.
It's fascinating though. I mean, I didn't know about this actually when I started researching this narrative.
Yeah. Oh, really?
I didn't know.
It's really complicated. Bits of it are sort of problematic. Like, you know, he uses the terms left brain and right brain a lot, which are not really used anymore except as a metaphor, for example. But basically, he argues that when you adopt an alphabet and democratize literacy, the left brain, which is associated with analysis and rigidity and rules, swells. And so for the next 100 years, you get this cultural suppression of anything associated with right brain thinking. So openness, the banning of images, you get witch hunts, all kinds of things. So one of the interesting aspects of this theory is that we are ourselves a literature-based culture. So the way that we think about the birth of civilization is really biased toward when literature is created. So this is where you start to see these kinds of stories about like sun gods. Sun gods are typically associated with authoritarian rigidity, but it's also one of the ways in which we think about civilization and statehood. So yeah, sun gods fighting serpents, and the consequent definition based on this first archetype of what a hero is, which will, you know, later bleed into Greek thought. To back up Leonard Shlain's theory, there's the story of Inanna. So Inanna was a Sumerian goddess. A lot of the myths that we know have their origins and roots in Sumerian mythology, which are some of the first writings that we've ever found. And the myths of the goddess Inanna specifically were written by the high priestess Enheduanna, probably around 2200 BC. And what's interesting about that time was that Sumerian culture was undergoing a lot of really interesting disruption. It was actually in her lifetime moving from an oral storytelling culture to a literary one because they had just invented cuneiform. Yeah, her father Sargon is typically credited with this. So I think it's Sargon, or maybe it's Hammurabi. I will double check that. But yeah, so within her lifetime, this is happening. And so what she's doing, she's a princess and also a high priestess. And in Babylonian culture, or Sumerian culture rather, all of sort of the economy and the community of this region was organized around the temple, around the economy of the temple. So what she is doing in her lifetime is strangely elevating Inanna above all other gods of the pantheon. Inanna is the goddess of sex, the volatilities of life, etc. There's actually a very cute Garden of Eden variant story where Inanna is sitting under what's ostensibly the tree of knowledge and just admiring her own vulva.
Now that is a variant story that I can live with, rather than the COVID variant stories that we keep hearing.
Exactly.
Please, let's get some women's sexuality in here as a variant story, by all means.
Yeah, it's very charming. But one of Enheduanna's hymns is a narration of Inanna's fight with this mountain called Ibe. And she kicks this mountain's ass. It's horrible. And then she goes and she tells her grandfather An, who is the sky god. An typically loves her, like she's his fave. But in this case, he's kind of like, you need to walk that back. And the reason is because at the summit of the mountain Ibe is a perfect untouched garden that is in bloom all the time. And, you know, it's kind of like the lion is sitting by the lamb, like that kind of stuff. It's not the nature that Inanna controls. And this invites a really compelling idea, right? Like, what if we don't have to be subjected to the volatilities of nature? What if we could control it? At the time that Enheduanna is inscribing this hymn, there's also something happening in her own life and in the politics of the day. Her nephew, who's a king in a nearby city, has just declared himself a god, which has never happened before. You know, like pharaohs will do it later. We kind of do it. Like, I think that there's actually a statue in Washington, D.C. of George Washington as Zeus, or like, you know, carving our presidents into mountains. We still kind of do this, but it comes from this. So her nephew declares himself a god. And what this enables him to do is appropriate temple funds in order to spend the money and resources as he likes, and also expand his region. So you're kind of seeing with this birth of literacy that Enheduanna is living through, this also arrival of just a different way of thinking about how to organize society, perpetuated by this more warlike patriarchal behavior. So this is kind of what Enheduanna is expressing when she tells the story of Inanna and the mountain Ibe. And in fact, this will later impact her own life. Like some years after she wrote this story, she's kicked out of her own temple by a warrior invader who then replaces her for, you know, for the exact same purpose. So this is kind of like, there's a great writer who writes about Enheduanna and about Inanna called Betty Deschang Midor, and she talks about how this is kind of the defining moment where you get this sort of like a gender split between men and women, but also this divide between civilization and nature, which she describes as a trauma that we still haven't recovered from. So the hero's journey, like consequent stories of sun gods fighting with snakes, come from these first ideas of like, you know, these sorts of like patriarchal cultures coming and getting rid of these old, more cohesive religions.
Yeah.
And from here, you get the birth of the hero's journey. I mean, it's more subtle in the context of the hero's journey, but even in the time of Campbell, this was a problem. Like, I think that in one case, he was describing the hero's journey like to a bunch of students, and a woman actually critiqued it. She was like, you know, like, where are the women? and I think he said something like, well, what's wrong with staying at home and holding down the fort, like that's heroic. As an alternative, though, it also merits mentioning that, like, one of the things Ursula Le Guin talks about a lot is that there are lots of different kinds of stories than the hero's journey, like different ways to narrate our lives and also the happenings of humanity. But because the hero's journey is so prevalent, it's really hard to conceptualize them. Like it's really hard even for us to think about ourselves as not central to our own story, you know, at one story among other stories. Like this is one of the gripping issues of the hero's journey. But in Greek mythology, for example, there are many myths of women specifically that take on a really different structure from the hero's journey. Interesting in myths about women, there's often a necessary journey into the underworld. Actually, a lot of men do this too. Ulysses does this too. Orpheus does this as well, the sort of journey through the underworld. And what this conveys and what the hero's journey does not, which is something that you touched upon earlier, is this idea that sometimes your life is not a series of like rises and falls, but mostly like you're on the way up the summit to something, you know, to ultimately triumph. These other kinds of stories, for example, Cupid and Psyche is a very good example, kind of convey instead that you have to enter the underworld. There's a version of you that has to die. And this is, you're going to have to do it alone. Sometimes you'll get help, but it's a dark journey, like fairy tales, like the dark forest is a vestige of this idea. Yeah, traversing the underworld. And it's going to cause you pain because when a version of you dies, it's not just the parts that you're ready to let go of that die, it's a whole person. You know, that's what makes a sacrifice meaningful. That's what change necessitates. Like in order to like create a new cosmos, there has to be a meaningful cost such that even if you wanted to, you can't go back to be the person that you were before because it's not possible. That person has effectively died. So this was a lot more common in early oral storytelling and also specifically storytelling related to women. For example, the genre of menstrual myths, of which the Garden of Eden once was a part, and also Sleeping Beauty and Snow White. These are also adapted versions of menstrual myths that are now chivalric stories, but they still carry this seed of, in order to be reborn, you first have to die, and it's horrible. That's not a story that we like a lot, but Ursula Le Guin also proposes a different approach to the hero's journey, which is something that she calls, again, the carrier bag theory of fiction. Her argument is the way that we narrate our progression is based on this idea that the first technology was a man lifting up a stick or something to probably like strike or kill another man, you know, classic Cain and Abel. And you can sort of trace that all the way to the dick rockets of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos.
Yeah. Or the Dick skyscraper, the Salesforce skyscraper in San Francisco, which I always say looks like a giant penis, which it does. That's my opinion, of course. So
sure, yeah, but they are highly phallic, like just objectively phallic. But
phallic, that's a better word, yeah.
Like, what if there's an alternative to this? What if, you know, there was another technology that was created earlier or side by side, which would make sense, which is actually the carrier bag, because in hunter-gatherer society, like 70% of nutrition did not come from hunting. Like hunting was really energy inefficient. You didn't have like, you know, just a deer running by all the time. So it was kind of like an exciting thing that happened, you know, but it was quite rare to eat meat, in fact. Most of what you were eating was the stuff of gatherers. So it was herbs, it was fruits, it was nuts. And in order to facilitate that, probably you had to go far from your community, which meant that you probably required a carrier bag of some kind, either to carry a child or to carry back whatever it was that you found. But this idea of the receptacle is not really considered a technology, and there are lots of reasons why that is. But Ursula Le Guin kind of argues that if we thought about technology this way, we might actually change the way that we perceive narrative and thus storytelling. And the great thing is this doesn't have to be a complicated thought exercise. There are lots of stories that exist that are not heroes' journeys, but because we're so married to it, it might feel a little bit uncomfortable, you know?
Exactly. We are very married to the hero's journey. And it is that redemption factor, that promise of, if I suffer, it's almost like a logical fallacy, right? If I suffer, then I will be redeemed or delivered into a higher and better state of more wisdom and more clout or something. And it's a false positive is what I would say, because life does not always work that way. And so, yeah, it's quite an easy sales pitch. A hero's journey is an easy sales pitch. Who doesn't want something that will redeem them? Who doesn't want to read a story about a tragedy that someone gets redeemed in? And I mean, as a journalist, I can tell you, not every story ends in redemption. Some simply end in tragedy, and that's the end.
Yeah,
And
sometimes people stay dead. And this is part of the risk and reward of living, right? Like
exactly.
a redemption story kind of loses that aspect of you might die. And in fact, you might have to in order for this to matter. A redemption story is more like, well, maybe if you just say sorry. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
You're humbled. Yeah.
Yeah. We should do an episode on forgiveness narratives, because that's a very deep subject to go into. And honestly, the forgiveness narratives are used so much by large corporations when they, like when a company has an oil spill, an oil company has an oil spill, there's always some kind of forgiveness narrative about we're building back better, and reimagining the way we interact with natural resources that will always come about in that narrative. So I think that I'm going to earmark that for a new episode, actually.
Yeah.
So in closing this episode, I want to emphasize to everyone, as I've stated several times, every hero's journey does not end in some sort of redemption or success or learning experience. Maybe a learning experience to some degree, yes. But what I would caution all of you to do is, when you see these narratives coming up in products you're looking at, or tech companies, or anything like that, is really question what is beneath them and what potential unintended consequences exist from something that is promising you deliverance from your suffering. Because there's always these unintended consequences that we don't always look at, and we tend to get very sidelined by the promise of some sort of success or light at the end of the tunnel. So I'm not telling everyone to be completely skeptical, but just look beneath the surface and save yourself a lot of heartache, potentially.
And I'll say, the world doesn't actually need 8 billion heroes, 8 billion messiahs. You see that a lot in environmental narratives as well, right? Like this matter of saving the world. You actually get a lot more space in your own life and in the way that you narrate your life if you release this idea and also this pressure of the hero's journey, like being the central character upon whom everything relies, but also in exchange, like for whom everything exists. More cohesive narratives don't just include the idea that we're players in much larger stories that aren't about us. Like, they're also about this idea that we're not the only players. It introduces this possibility of relative personhood. Like when I say we're not the only players, I mean not only humans. It introduces the possibility that nature and animals and everything alive around us also has an agency and also has things that it's interested in, and we're in these complex interactions with them. So yeah, just something to think about while thinking outside of the box of the hero's journey.
We are so happy you joined us today to debrief on the hero's journey. In our next episode, we are going to be talking about, not to continue this theme, but yes, to continue it, the narrative of the unbreakable warrior, one of everybody's favorite narratives, because it is just endearing strength and endurance. And there's a lot more to it, and we will get into details in the next episode. Come back and see us for truth.